Hello and welcome to this video which accompanies our conference paper on paternalism in the governance of artificial intelligence and automated decision-making in the United Kingdom. Sincere thanks to the organisers of the Data for Policy conference. We're looking forward to some stimulating discussions. A quick word about this presentation before we begin. This presentation is designed to be policy-oriented, by which we mean we're more focused on our conclusions and insights from our research than in the process of generating them. This is not a summary of our discussion paper, which we hope you'll read separately. There are three parts to the presentation, which we've color-coded for you. Part A is our recommendations. We have two main suggestions for what we think can usefully happen differently. Part B quickly gives some information about our draft paper, which is likely to be more of specialist interest to fellow researchers. And finally, Part C presents what we think of as some key ideas from our research. The intention there is to present some thoughts which we hope will be stimulating to colleagues in this field from a broad range of backgrounds. As promised, we're starting with our recommendations. Our first recommendation is that researchers could usefully pay more attention to critical perspectives on AI and ADM governance in the UK. By this we mean that we could all do more to develop an awareness of the different ways that different groups are approaching the same issues in this field, and in particular to interrogate foundational concepts more rigorously for possible weaknesses or purposeful uses which may run counter to assumptions. As legal researchers, we're especially concerned with what Charles D. Raab has called the turn to ethics, as opposed to legal regulation, in the field of information policy. And we're especially inspired by critical reflections on that point, like those advanced by Michael Veal in his recent work on the EC High-Level Ethics Group. The main thrust of our study, and hence why this is our first recommendation, is that there are worrying signs that UK governance of AI is low quality and likely to be ineffective. That's why we're interested in the possibility of more challenging research and in potential counter-movements to play a role in improving policy outcomes in this area. We're referring here especially to two key ideas that we'll examine later. One is that current UK policy measures demonstrably do not address likely harms from AI applications. We think that as those harms emerge through events, the weakness of UK policy is likely to be revealed. The other is that the real policy trade-off in this field is between the demands of business and government for confidentiality and secrecy, and the demand that our values and beliefs in effective social processes make for public participation in governance. We think that research can make more of a contribution in illuminating the nature and possible settlements of that trade-off. Our second recommendation is not just for researchers, but for civil society and policy makers too, by which we mean anyone working in government, parliament or the civil service. This is that we could all usefully rally around the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation as a pivotal organisation for the prospects of higher quality, less paternalistic AI governance in the UK. Our work suggests that CDEI's delivery on its mandate to lead on safe and ethical innovation in the use of data and AI is likely to prove very important to outcomes. We'd like to suggest more attention to CDEI's organisational status, specifically its problematic quasi-independence from government. The government is committed to putting CDEI on a statutory footing, and, provided that that footing is genuinely independent, we think that is likely to help make AI implementation safer and more ethical. We also think there should be more attention to and involvement in CDEI's work on public engagement on AI and ADM. And as we'll see, our work mainly addresses the question of participatory governance. This and similar lines of thinking might help inspire CDEI's work and suggest useful collaborations. The key idea this links to, and again we'll see this later, is that industrial strategy is the dominant policy agenda in this area of UK governance. This suggests more or less, in the current hierarchy of organisations and ideas, that some of our current debates, for example about data protection regulation or how public bodies are using AI, will be of worryingly little significance, at least until we can change the overall frame in which they are handled. This section sets out to deliver some very rapid information about our paper. As our title suggests, the paper is about paternalism in AI governance. We're not going to dwell on the idea of paternalism here or show our workings, but it's useful to explain how this concept motivated us. So why paternalism? Here we give a few hints about why we think this is a useful concept in the context of AI governance. We didn't focus on paternalism because we think it's necessarily wrong. Indeed, as we note in the paper, arguably paternalism is a necessary or in some instances desirable quality in governance. The idea of paternalism has deep roots, which make it an interesting counterpoint to a relatively novel field like AI, both in terms of values, for example links to theories of justice, and in terms of political relevance. So, for example, how far have politicians considered that this technology has considerable implications for individuals' freedom and capacity for self-determination? Are positions consistent with suspicions of the so-called nanny state? More specifically, from an academic point of view, paternalism concept relates to a long-running debate about choice environments in public affairs, nudges and so on, and to a specific recent debate about techno-paternalism, which is the idea that somehow the use of AI is infantilizing us. A quick word on methods. Our study used the narrative review method, which followed a search and selection process to assemble a list of 25 primary governance documents, which were then subjected to analysis. We've included a table with a full list of these documents in our paper, which may be of interest. What conclusions did we reach in our investigation of paternalism in this field of governance? Somewhat to our surprise, we found that both UK industrial strategy on AI and the UK standards for AI in the public sector are demonstrably paternalistic in nature, and the former is strongly so. While this is not necessarily a problem in itself, as we've noted, paternalism is widely accepted and in fact arguably inherent to all policy, it does suggest issues with the quality of governance in this instance. Accordingly, we suggest a healthy level of scepticism about the current governance of AI in the UK. On to some key ideas from our work. We have 5 key ideas that we'd like to talk about here. The first 2 are more ideas that we've worked on as background to our investigations, and then the following 3 are ideas that have emerged from our analysis. And that's why those final 3 are the ones that link to the recommendations that we've just presented. Our first key idea is that AI and automated decision-making are an especially difficult problem from a governance perspective. They are what we call a twofold subject. Here we see a highly simplified representation of a classic governance subject. Governance processes are the processes by which social order and collective action are organized. So in very general terms, they usually determine how things are organized. If we take some fairly ordinary subject like waste collection, the wheels of governance turn and waste is collected, or not, in certain ways which are good, or not. However, AI and ADM is not a classic subject. In this case, we see that the phenomenon under study is not simply affected by governance processes, but is itself acting to change the governance processes to which it is subject. This simplified observation is of course much more complicated in practice and has various implications. It suggests, for example, that the way government works, from an administrative point of view, is changing, and that AI implies not simply consideration of possible legislative or other initiatives, but in fact, in some sense, a general reappraisal of the rule of law. Our work pursues this idea based on specific lines of thought in law, in ways that we think connect to the arguments of Roger Brownsword and others. In research terms, our previous work shows that there's reasons to believe that ADM tends to undercut highly significant rights and obligations around the freedom of information requests, litigation, disclosure, and so on, with worrying implications for constitutional functionality and individual political empowerment. This links to what we understand as a growing consensus in civil society circles that state applications of AI in criminal justice, in particular, are undercutting important safeguards for individuals. In our view, this is one of the ways in which we're beginning to see AI emerge into what Jeff Mulgan calls the real work of contextual application, as opposed to conceptual abstraction. And it involves thinking about participatory governance, which is an idea associated with Bovens, Kuhlman, and others. Participation involves legitimacy in governance. It suggests quality, the wisdom of crowds, sustainable policy, and so on. This is not really accountability in the generally intended sense, or about democratic representation, but rather direct public participation in governance through legal processes, especially citizens seeking to gather information about, understand and contest what public actors and other citizens are doing. Our second key idea is that we can't rely on a straightforward understanding of the concept of trust. This is a huge subject in itself, but how we intend to show this here is by suggesting a dissonance between more technical perspectives on the concept of trust and perspectives from politics. On the left, we suggest some views from civil servants and from computer scientists, and on the right, those of politicians and sociologists. Everyone agrees that trust is important, but on the left it is understood to be something that can be intentionally constructed, engendered, maximized in system design, and so on. Whereas on the right it is a mess that needs to be acknowledged and responded to. It is eroded, broken, or low and falling. This matters because technically minded actor groups seem to be placing too much faith on the idea of trust as a guiding concept. For civil servants developing policy, it is worth remembering that there are serious flaws in the idea that the nation-state is the leading unit in technological innovation. And this is what Edgerton calls techno-nationalism. Whatever the prospects for policy to stimulate the benefits of innovation, experience suggests that harms may also result and may lead to hardening attitudes, which is in fact a failure of trust. For computer scientists, the comparable risks can be understood in terms of what Miller calls social failure modes, the evident tendency for social dimensions of technology applications to cause them to fail in anticipatable, though not currently widely anticipated ways. In this slide, we cite some of the work that we considered in working out what contribution thinking about participation in governance might make to the idea of trust in the governance of AI. And given our interest in participation and contestation, we're particularly interested in what the Government Office for Science calls straightforward routes of challenge. Our third key idea is that the measures currently under development as policy in UK AI governance don't match the harms which we anticipate may arise from AI applications and automated decision-making. So what? Effective policy mitigates risks as well as delivering public value. Justice demands that remediable harms are avoided. Governance that does not address harms probably serves some other purpose and is worthy of suspicion. So starting here with harms, one of the effects of the turn to ethics in this field is that the potential harms are quite well discussed. This table sets out some of the harms our analysis found discussed in UK governance documents, approximately categorized across societal and individual and material and non-material distinctions. Whereas in this table, we set out some of the measures that were considered in the documents. The main measures enacted in law were in data protection. And then there were measures we described as underdevelopment by government. And finally, there were mere suggestions or commentary put forward by a range of actors, but not apparently taken up by government. In our view, measures that are under development are particularly interesting and warrant focus, and this is the category that most closely describes government policy and manifests empowered intent in governance terms. Our observation here is that the relationship of measures to harms is not neat, but rather highly selective and partial. So, for example, the AI sector deal focuses on possible loss of anticipated economic opportunity to the exclusion of other potential harms, for example, to competition or in labour markets. Or another example, legal liability regimes are a big recent focus in the EU, with lots of consideration of how and why, but in the UK are not a priority, largely because of Brexit and the prospect of divergence. Of course, this is not a surprise for students of politics and policy. For example, Kingdon's theory suggests that policies relate to problems in strange and counterintuitive ways. But we do think these questions warrant more discussion. How are relevant harms understood and why? What else motivates measures in this area except for harms? We came to the conclusion that paternalism in this area of UK governance is associated with a degree of carelessness about these questions. And our point is rather that, if we're convinced by ethical analyses of potential harm, we can expect events to focus attention on them in due course as they come to pass, and also expect this will tend to affect perceptions of current measures. So, in terms of questions of policy and trust, in this field, we see much more vulnerability to a future cooling than is widely appreciated. This is the first point on which our recommendation for more critical perspectives focuses. Our fourth key idea is that the quality of policy in this field depends on resolution of a trade-off between limiting and opening access to information. Limiting access to information is justified in terms of disclosure risks. Opening it involves the benefits and problems of participation. As a technology, AI calls into question historical settlements on this question and demands re-evaluation. Our analysis considered how governance actors approach the question of public participation in AI governance. As this slide relates, the recent materials we considered don't tend to consider the public as challengers, for example, through raising objections, not just to policy, but to AI applications via legal processes. The exception, of course, is in data protection, notably the so-called right to explanation introduced by the GDPR. But as we show in our paper, this is much more limited in application and practical significance than is often understood. Even beyond challenge, there is a remarkable lack of resolve in terms of how public participation in this field of governance is imagined and targeted. Actors tend to handle the public as a tame species, and to seek safe, controllable ways to incorporate them into the policy recipe. We do not suggest that public participation be re-evaluated as an absolute good, something to be maximised without regard to other factors. But certainly it is relevant and worth considering as a more prominent feature of policy around AI for the reasons we've discussed previously. Rather, the question is, what disclosure risks justify constraint to participation, and to what legitimate extent or in which ways? And so here we list some of the concerns which were apparent as balancing considerations to participation. Trade secrecy in business is more prominent here than is generally recognised as an issue in this field, as are the wide special categories for processing under the Data Protection Act 2018. We suggest a comprehensive and detailed investigation into these disclosure risks as the second focus for our recommendation about critical perspectives in research. Our fifth and final key idea is that AI governance in the UK is comprised of three distinct agendas, and that, far from being equal, the industrial strategy is in all significant respects the dominant agenda. The first agenda we suggest is data protection law, which is distinguished as the only agenda involving significant enacted law in the GDPR and the Data Protection Act 2018. This is the main focus for academics, certainly for legal academics, and also for regulators, such as the ICO, working with the Alan Turing Institute. The second agenda is the industrial strategy, involving the AI sector deal, which grew out of Hall-Presenti review. Incidentally, the Hall-Presenti review is a remarkably socially and ethically significant document, considering that it explicitly excluded social and ethical issues from its remit. And the third agenda is a less widely regarded one, at least outside the civil service, and involves AI standards in the public sector, expressed in the 2018 Data Ethics Framework. Although each of these agendas and their relationship to each other are interesting in various ways, the key idea is that industrial strategy dominates. This is remarkable because the industrial strategy agenda is based on a very narrow logic about anticipated harms, as we've mentioned, being exclusively based on a specific understanding of economic prospects, which more or less denies that the harms or other harms are real or worth taking into account. Ethical and societal implications have been overwhelmed or at best marginalized. Very quickly, the suggestion of dominance is not just about resource allocation or prominence in governmental narrative, but also influence on the other narratives. So documents clarifying data protection regulation are addressed to business and show concern to minimize perceived burdens on businesses. AI in the public sector must be exploited so that it does not fall behind private organizations in terms of productive efficiency gains. As we note in our paper, commentaries from abroad are consistent in observing that AI governance in the UK is concentrated on industrial policy. However, this does not appear to be widely or consistently acknowledged domestically. So, for example, civil society tends to be focused on public sector applications and academia on data protection. This is the idea behind our recommendation that there could be a more general and determined focus on CDEI's role, because CDEI is identified, as we mentioned before, as playing a key role in the industrial strategy agenda. Thanks for watching this video. We hope you'll find it stimulating. Please do get in touch if you have any comments or suggestions, and it would be great to hear from you.